Hey everyone, this is That Guy in Hutch, Jason Probst, and you're listening to That Podcast in Hutch. Before I get started with my guest for this week, I want to take a couple of minutes to talk about what's gone on over the last couple of weeks. Many of you at this point probably know that my son Mitchell was in a pretty bad bicycle accident in Wichita where he was struck by a car, and Saturday we got a call that he was in the hospital, and so his family rushed over there, and we were prepared for a very long and hard recovery, but largely thanks to, I think, so much support and prayers and thoughts from people in our community. He made a very fast recovery. He still has some road to travel ahead of him, but he was released from the hospital much sooner than we expected, and he's doing remarkably well. And I appreciate everyone's thoughts and concerns and their prayers on that. And I hope you'll keep him coming because he still has some work to do to get back to full health. But it was a reminder to me about the power and the importance of community. And in that, I want to make sure, and there's a lot of people to thank, but on the podcast, Jackson Swearer filled in for me for a couple of weeks, and that took a lot of pressure off of me. I really try to do everything I can to keep producing this on a weekly basis. And I think that's important to keep that consistency. And faced with a family emergency like that, I had to reach out and I had to rely on someone to help me. And Jackson filled in and did a couple of great interviews while I was taking care of my family business. And I really want to thank him and appreciate that. And if you didn't get a chance to go back and listen to those, he had a great interview with a daycare provider talking about some of the issues there. And then with David Sotelo, who talked about his work on the Human Relations Council. So again, if you didn't get a chance to listen to those, go back and find those. But again, I want to thank everyone for their help and their support and everything they did over the last couple of weeks to help our family and to help Mitch. I won't forget it, and I want to thank you again. So now I'm going to introduce my guest for this week. It's Chris Courtwright, and he's not out in front very often, but for years and years he's worked in a very important role, kind of helping government work and decide how much, what the budget's going to look like and what kind of money we have to play with. So he's currently a member of the the Governor's Council on Tax Reform. And in 2020, he retired after 34 years as the Kansas legislature's principal economist. And he also served as a member of the prestigious Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. And we're going to talk about that a little bit in this podcast. He's also been the author of Kansas Tax Facts, which is a document that comes out every year. And I've found it to be incredibly useful to kind of understand what's going on. He's been a keynote speaker at the Kansas Economic Policy Conference, which I've been to, and it's a great event that really kind of dives into economic policy if you like that sort of thing. And he's also presented at the Federal Reserve Regional Economic Roundtable and the Journal of Policy History Conference. So that's a lot to say that Chris Courtwright is an economist. He's served in some pretty big roles. He's worked with me this year to kind of help me wrap my mind around some tax policy and fiscal matters that are probably not things that I would understand very well without his help. So Chris, thanks for coming on today and being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me, Jason.
Well, the first thing I wanted to ask you about is how does a person early in their life decide that they want to be an economist?
I'm happy to go over how all that happened in my case. Before I do, I wanted to say how happy we are to hear that your son is doing well. And you mentioned the power and importance of community. I might add that thank goodness for the power and importance of access to high quality health care in a situation like that. Something I think underlines that. My journey to an economist was to becoming an economist was an interesting one. I was in high school in the late 1970s, and this was post-Watergate, the era of Woodward and Bernstein, right? Mm-hmm. So when I graduated from high school, I went off to the University of Kansas to go to journalism school. And the William Allen White School of Journalism, of course, is one of the best schools in the country. I was going to be the next Woodward and Bernstein, don't you know, yeah. Right? And in fact, I got one of my undergraduate degrees from the William Allen White School of Journalism. I found out, though, that in that era, as now, that's not a field that pays all that well. And so at the time I graduated with undergraduate degrees in journalism, economics, and history, it was the opportunity to go to work for very little money or consider graduate school. And at that point, I decided to go back to graduate school in economics. I started taking economics as just a core course while I was working on my journalism degree, and I liked it. I ended up picking up my undergraduate degree there, and then ended up going on to graduate school also at KU into the master's program for my graduate training. And so that's a long way of saying I didn't think I'd get there if you talked to me when I was 18 years old, but I guess it's a left brain, right brain thing, right? You got to be able to have some kind of quantitative skills. And so after as I was graduating from leaving grad school, I heard that the state might be hiring, the legislature in particular. And when I started working here in the State House in the mid-1980s, there was really only one other economist sort of on staff. And they were looking to hire, and so I came on board here, and then I worked here for the next 34 years, and then pretty much 15 minutes after I retired here a couple of years ago, the governor appointed me to her council on tax reform because I'd known her for many years from her time as a legislator, and just have always been involved in tax policy. Right, one of the main things I did was staff all the legislative tax committees and councils.
I want to go back to this Woodward and Bernstein thing, because in that time period, everybody wanted to be a journalist, right? That was dynamic.
Absolutely.
They had undone a president. They had the Operation Deep Throat and all that, and they had found this information about the president and some of the shady things that have been going on. And it really created for a lot of people that were coming of age at that time. Journalism was a very appealing field, but I know very well about the pay issues in journalism. We never could pay our people enough. I never felt like I was paid enough. But if it's a career that you want that's rewarding and fulfilling and exciting, it's the right one. But if you're trying to run a family on it, not all that great. So when you got to the state, and you started working as an economist, what sort of thing? You said you'd staff the tax committees. So kind of walk us through a little bit what that entailed. Like, what sort of things did you bring to the committee, and what sort of information do you have to prepare as an economist for the legislature to help them have good information to make well-informed decisions?
Yeah, one of the things that people often want to know about, and there's two staff agencies involved in the day-to-day operations of a committee. There is the reviser of statutes office. They're the official attorneys and legal eagles who write the bills and amendments that you guys will pass into law. And then there's the research department, which is my former agency, and we sort of do everything else, including quantify that legislation, right? And need knowledge of all the different areas of tax law. And of course, in Kansas, one of the things I quickly learned is that we have always preferred the diversified approach in terms of the state and local revenue portfolio, right? When we talk about three legs to the stool, we're talking about sales tax, income tax, and property tax. Mm-hmm. There's some states that don't have that diversification. Texas, of course, doesn't have an income tax, right? And sometimes that gets thrown in our face. But on the other hand, a lot of the tax councils and people, and the Governor's Council on Tax Reform just looked at this too. Because their revenue portfolio is not as balanced and diversified, they have a much more volatile potential negative set of outcomes. One example of that, and this happened right around the time I started working here in the mid-1980s, there was a very bad regional recession back in 1986, 1987. If you look up nationally, you won't see any reference of a recession because there wasn't quite an official national recession. But here in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, kind of in the ag and energy belt here, there was a very bad regional recession. And the price per barrel of oil went to $9 a barrel, and the price per MCF of gas went to 50 cents. Okay, really, really bad stuff. And there was terrible times in the public sector here in Kansas, right? A year or so after I started working here, and there were huge cuts to budgets. John Carlin was governor, and the 1986 legislature had already passed a budget for the upcoming fiscal year. But by the time the legislature got back to town in January of 1987, that budget was already underwater. So they had to go in and enact rescissions, cuts in money that had already been approved and in some cases spent for the balance of fiscal 87. Very, very tough times, and all the way around. As bad as all of that was in Kansas, it was much, much worse in Texas. And again, often these states that have low income taxes, or in Texas case, no income taxes, that's thrown in our face. Well, that's for economic development. Some businesses want to locate in Texas and this kind of thing where there's no income tax. But because Texas' revenue portfolio is not as balanced and diversified, they get all of their money from severance taxes and sales taxes, right? Taxes on oil and gas and sales taxes. But when oil went to $9 a barrel and gas went to 50 cents per MCF,
not much tax revenue.
Yeah, oil rig workers out in West Texas are laid off. No one has any money to spend. Next thing you know, gleaming office buildings in Houston and Dallas are kicking tenants out. Guys in $900 suits are without a job. And the whole economy just collapsed. And the money stopped coming into the public sector. And they had it way, way worse than we had in Kansas. Again, they had their eggs in fewer baskets, or pick whatever analogy you like. So that's one reason policymakers have preferred sort of the balanced approach in Kansas. The idea of a three-legged stool is a three-legged stool is sturdier than a one or two-legged stool if there's a windstorm. Picture a stool sitting out on your porch in windy western Kansas, right? You're going to be able to weather that windstorm better if you've got your more diversification. The other component to this, and we talked a lot about this in the recently released report of the Governor's Tax Council. The other thing policymakers since the 80s have thought about the balanced approach is it provides different kinds of equity, right? There's the notion of, right, those doggone college students, okay, they're not paying as much income tax, but at least we sort of get them with the sales tax and the property tax on their 15-year-old cars, right? Or if you're a manufacturing business, we're going to maybe give you every sales tax exemption known to man, and maybe even you get a property tax break from your city or county commission. But at least if you're profitable, we're going to kind of get you with an income tax, right? So no matter who or what you were, you probably have some skin in the game if the revenue net is cast more broadly, right? Equity issues. Another kind of equity issue is the notion that is talked about a lot more at the State House, and that is the kind of progressivity, regressivity thing. The sales tax, of course, is considered the most regressive of the three major tax sources, hardest on those who can least afford to pay, right? And this ties into the food issue, which I'm sure we'll talk about, and it's been the hot topic here this session.
Sure.
Sales tax is the most regressive. Income tax is by far the most progressive. Of the three, and we have a 3-bracket system. The more brackets you have, the more progressive. Kansas, when I started working here, had a 7 or 8 bracket system, and we're now down to 3. For a while, under the failed Brownback tax experiment, we had a 2-bracket system. Then that was repealed in 2017. We moved back to a 3-bracket system. And then property tax is somewhere in the middle. Sometimes people who are upset about the property tax will call it regressive. I don't think it is. I think, if anything, it's modestly progressive. I think the more income you have, the more property you tend to own. But it's somewhere in the middle. So there's different kinds of equity. The overall state and local tax system, based on analysis, is believed to be regressive, even though there's an income tax in there. Okay, when you take the sales tax and the liquor and the cigarette taxes and all these other taxes that are mostly regressive, the overall combined state and local tax system is harder on the folks who can least afford to pay than it is those who are more blessed with income and wealth. Now, it's even worse than that in states that don't have an income tax, like Texas and Florida and some of these other states. But nevertheless, it's a fair point that the tax system is harder on those folks who can least afford to pay.
Well, and we are going to talk a little bit about the food tax later, because I have a couple of questions I want to ask about that. But the point that you made about regressive tax policy, and particularly sales tax, the idea on that is that working families and poor families tend to have to spend more of their income on necessities, right? Like the percentage of food cost, what food cost for everybody, but for a family that is living off of $30,000 a year, they are spending a higher percentage of their income on necessities like food and hygiene products than a family that's making $200,000 a year. They may be spending a more dollar amount on food, but as a percent of their overall income, it's far less. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So in your work, you're looking at all these things. You're looking at, and we've had, and we won't get into all of those, but we've had some interesting conversations about just different tax streams and different tax exemptions. There's a lot of tax exemptions that have been created over the years. But one of the things I wanted to explain, because the timing of this will publish the day after, this will publish next week on Thursday, and I believe on Wednesday is the next publication of the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. And this kind of is what we build our budget around. And you were on that, and you helped create this measurement for years. So I kind of help us understand it. It plays a big role in state government, it plays a big role in how we budget and how we set tax policy. But I suspect that few people have much understanding of what goes into that. So tell me a little bit about what you guys do when the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group meets and talks about what the expectation is for revenue in the coming year.
Absolutely. I guess it's one of the things that's talked about a lot, and there's monthly reports and all the rest of it, but very few people understand the history and the background of the process. I guess it's called the Consensus Revenue Estimating Process. And if you look up the word consensus in the dictionary, it'll say something like, unanimity of opinion. Well, why do we call this thing the consensus group? And I guess the reason we call it that is to make clear that we're doing it differently than what happens at the federal level. Okay. I don't know how anyone in Washington, D.C. can realistically make public policy. It is such a complicated universe to operate in. Often you'll have the White House with one set of numbers and budget assumptions, and the Congressional Budget Office with another, and the House Republicans with another, and the Senate Democrats with another, and some partisan special interest group with a fifth set, right? Now, at least if you're a member of Congress with 10 or 20 different interns and gophers on your staff, they can help you sort through all these different sets of assumptions about how to make your decisions. But the idea in a small state like Kansas with a part-time citizen legislature is look, we don't have that kind of sophistication. And it's silly to do it that way anyway. So let's get everyone on the same page. Let's all agree going in that 1 cent of sales tax is worth X and 5 cents of cigarette tax is worth Y. And then as policymakers, everyone can choose up sides and start fighting about whether they want to raise or lower the sales or the cigarette tax. But for crying out loud, let's not have everybody sort of cooking the numbers going into that debate. Okay.
Yeah, so, but based on this, we're all working with the same baseline figures.
And the governor is required by law to base his or her budget on what the consensus group does.
Okay.
So everyone's got to use that. And what the consensus group does is it convenes twice a year, once in November and once in April, to estimate receipts for the current fiscal year and the next fiscal year. So right now we're a couple plus months from the end of fiscal 22. Fiscal 22 ends on June 30th, and July 1st is the first day of fiscal 23. Mm-hmm. So when the consensus group met last November, it was 3 or 4 months into fiscal 22, and they had those receipts there, and they said, okay, we now are going to guess for all the major tax sources, income taxes and sales taxes and liquor and severance and cigarette and all these other taxes that come into the state general fund, how much in receipts is going to come in for the next 8 months of fiscal 22, and then fiscal 23, which starts on July 1st of calendar 22, we're going to take a guess for those receipts in that year as well, because that fiscal 23 is the year that the 2022 legislature builds the budget for, right? You guys, before you leave town, will set the for the fiscal year that's going to kick in July 1st. And hope nothing happens like did back in 1987, where it goes underwater while you're not in town, right?
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of the background. But how do they use a dartboard or a Ouija board? How do they guess what's going to happen for the next 12 to 18 months all the time? Well, but a week, but the main meeting, as you said, is next Wednesday, April 20th. And about a week before the main meeting, it happened here a couple days ago, the whole consensus group gathers. The press doesn't even really know about this, but there's what's called an economic outlook meeting. And the members of the consensus group convene, and they all agree that, okay, inflation for the next 12 to 18 months is this. Kansas personal income is that. The unemployment rate is going to be this. Here's what's happening in the key sectors of the Kansas economy: oil and gas, aviation manufacturing, agriculture. Here's what's going on in sort of the Johnson County corridor. All these critical things, and many, many hours and ancillary meetings happen. We meet with oil and gas industry sources to talk about severance taxes. You know, who really knows about the price per barrel of oil? It can be very volatile based on what OPEC is doing or whether Putin invades Ukraine or all these other things, right? But you got to take your best stab at it by looking at futures markets and all these other things. So there's 6 voting members of the consensus group, but everyone agrees a week before the main meeting on these. Okay, I'm going to make my sales and my income and my liquor tax estimates based on inflation being this and personal income being that, and everyone agrees on the economic outlook.
Okay.
And then the consensus group scatters and goes their 6 separate ways, and independently of one another, with no collaboration, prepares individual estimates for each state general fund tax source that's on that table of receipts you're familiar looking at. Sales taxes, income taxes, liquor taxes, cigarette taxes, corporation income taxes. There's a number of tax sources that come into the state general fund. And what happens at the main meeting next Wednesday, I guess it's a little bit like selection of a pope if you're Catholic, or a brokered political convention back in the day. It's not public. The consensus group actually has an exemption from the Open Meetings Act. And what goes on behind closed doors isn't discussed, right? When there's a new pope, there's a certain color of smoke that comes out of the Sistine Chapel, right? Yeah. And when the political bosses would emerge from a political party convention back in the day, you know, the infighting would go on behind closed doors, but they would come out with a unified front and saying, this guy is our presidential nominee, right? He may be an SOB, but he's our SOB, and so we're all on the same page from now on. Yep. That's a little bit the way the consensus process works. Again, there's a consensus. These are the numbers. We throw away the individual 6 different source estimates, right? If you went out and had a beer with me after the meeting, I might tell you that I think the sales tax estimate is $5 million too high, and the Department of Revenue might tell you they think it's $10 million too low. But you couldn't buy enough beer to get me drunk enough to violate that confidence. Okay, we all agree, no, the joint number is this. Yeah. Okay. The 6 different voting members of the group who do all of this are my former agency, the research department, on behalf of the legislature. And then there's the Department of Revenue and the Division of the Budget on behalf of the administration. Okay. And then we have a consulting economist from really sort of each of the state's 3 flagship universities. There's an expert from KU, one from K-State, and one from Wichita State. Okay. And they gather behind closed doors and release these numbers. And then the evening of the meeting, usually around 5 or 5:30, there will be a press conference. The Division of the Budget and the Research Department will hold a press conference saying, here's the new numbers. and they've gone up or down relative to the November estimate. So the estimate that's coming here next Wednesday will revise the fiscal 22 estimates. We will now be 10 and a half months into the fiscal year.
So we have more information.
Yeah, more information.
And
the reason it's done in the spring, when I started working here, the law said that the spring consensus estimate had to be done on or before April 4th. Well, about 15 years or so ago, the legislature started taking the whole month of April off anyway. And so we said, look, it's silly. We have better information if we can push that date back. So we got you guys to pass a bill to push the date back to April. Now it says on or before April 20th. And they're in fact meeting on April 20th this year. And obviously the reason that date is so critical is income taxes.
More tax returns have come.
Yes, and state income taxes in particular are very bottom heavy in terms of a state's fiscal year, right? Some taxes will come in, take the annual number, divide it by 12, and you get about that much in every month. Income taxes are not that way, right? There's a whole lot more money, March, April, May, June, in the final, sort of 3-4 months of the fiscal year, way more than a third or a fourth of the individual income tax money comes crashing in as people go to file and reconcile their returns for the previous tax year, right? So many, many years, if there's a big surprise, positive or negative, it's happened during April and May as you guys are kind of winding down your session. So we pushed the date back to give us, and that's one of the key things that happens behind closed doors, is the Department of Revenue gives us the very latest data on returns, right? How many returns have been filed, how many more they think are still out there, what's the average refund this year versus last year, what was the average balance due remittance of people who owed money this year versus last year, right? They track all of this. So besides how much did the Kansas economy grow last year and how did layoffs in one industry affect things and some of these macroeconomic variables, the people who actually process the returns are at the table giving us this latest information. And so there's a lot of discussion about where the tax filing things are. And it got more problematic the last couple of years because of the pandemic. The feds, for a year or two, pushed back the filing deadlines, right? And that's finally washed itself out now. And this year, it's April 18th is the filing deadline for both state and federal instead of the 15th because it's Emancipation Day or something in Washington, D.C. But yeah, it's back to being April 15th now. So the idea is they'll have the best possible information. Will be out there, and there'll be a new baseline when the legislature reconvenes on Monday, April 25th, I believe, is the first day of the so-called veto session. But back in the day, the veto session was supposed to only be considered for overriding vetoes. The legislature, when I started working in this building in the 1980s, would actually do its job in the first 3 months of the session and pass a budget and pass changes in tax law and all other kinds of laws in the first 3 or 4 months of the session and just come back for a 3 or 4 day veto session. Yeah. What started happening, especially by the 1990s, is virtually none of the major decisions are made in the first 3 months of the session. Almost all of the major things, especially as it relates to tax policy, often happen during the veto session at this point. People think, wow, boy, there's going to be money taken away or more money added in April. So realistically, we can't know that until the veto session. So human nature being to procrastinate, a lot of times the major decisions are pushed off until late April, early May in the veto session. And several times when things were so gridlocked under the previous administration, when Sam Brownback was governor, the veto session actually crashed clear into the month of June. I think 3 times since the 1860s, the legislature has been in town in the month of June, and 2 of those times were under Sam Brownback because things were so tough. The decisions that the legislature writ large had to make because of the magnitude of the crisis, that it just took the policymakers in the legislative branch that much more time to be able to reach an agreement. And finally, after some years of that, in 2017, they passed something that the governor vetoed, and then the legislature ended up overriding his veto. Mm-hmm. And so I think that might have been one of the years it went clear till the month of June as well.
Yeah. So in that, there's been a lot of discussion this year. Well, let me back up. What you're talking about certainly has been the case since I've been here, that we tend to hold the big things off until after that break in April. We come back in May, and we have these very long and intense days where we're trying to catch up with all the work and deal with tax policy and deal with changes to the budget based on that information. I wanted to talk a little bit about the sales tax on food. That's been probably one of the dominant conversations in the state this year. The governor, of course, came out with a plan to eliminate the state portion of sales tax on food, which would be 6.5% reduction across the board on food. Since then, there's been a lot of discussion about should we do it all at once? Some people favor phasing it in over a number of years. Some people want to reduce the overall income or the overall sales tax rate by a smaller amount, 0.2%. If you're somebody like me who doesn't really spend any money on anything besides the necessities, that doesn't really save me a whole lot. But there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of wrangling around about how that's going to work out. But you provided me one time with an interesting history of the sales tax on food. And so my two questions here, and we can look at one of them and then talk about that a little bit and move on to the other. But my one question is about the history of the food sales tax. And the other is what it means or what it could mean for the economy. You were talking before about some of these factors that the consensus revenue group looks at. And I'm really curious to hear what it might mean or what we anticipate it could mean in economic activity to see that kind of reduction in sales tax. So start with the history and tell me some of the history of the food sales tax.
Okay. Kansas, like a lot of states, put our sales tax on in the 1930s. The first state to enact something that smells like a sales tax is, I think, West Virginia in the early 1920s. And by 1930, there were 12 states that had sales taxes. And by 1940, there were 30 states. So a lot of states put them on in the 1930s for obvious reasons, right?
Was this in response to the Depression?
Yes, absolutely. There was tremendous stresses on society and the public sector. And so many states implemented a sales tax in the 1930s, Kansas among them. And in Kansas, we put ours on in 1937. And I found some old files one time and dug back through them. The issue of sales tax on food was present right away. Mm-hmm. Kansas was, when the legislature enacted the sales tax in 1937, they were cognizant that other states, a number of other states who had put the sales tax on had exempted groceries, mm-hmm. what we call food, from the sales tax. But Kansas opted not to do it. It said, look, we'll get less money, so for now we're going to go ahead and put the state sales tax on food. There were not local sales taxes in the 1930s, but it was just the state rate, and the state rate when it was put on was 2%. So a 2% sales tax kicked in 1937. The idea of exempting food, the reason it was around so much is what you just said. It's a necessity, right? And states have been cognizant ever since they started putting sales taxes on of the regressivity issue and on necessities. Virtually all 45 states that have a sales tax have exemption for prescription drugs, mm-hmm. right? And we have that in Kansas. Kansas and I'm guessing 40 to 45 of the 45 states with sales taxes have an exemption for residential utilities, right? Everybody has to pay their gas bill and their electric bill, so we're not going to put the state sales tax on that. There's exemptions for prosthetic devices, as you might imagine, right? Mm-hmm. Prescription drugs. So a lot of these things in some states will exempt diapers and baby formula, right? But food has always been the big issue. And in Kansas, we've been talking about whether to exempt food or not, literally since 1937.
Yeah, as soon as the tax went on, there was an immediate conversation about should we be taxing food?
Yeah, absolutely. And then in 1978, the legislature kept studying this all through the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then in the 70s, Kansas said, well, look, we don't know if we can afford to exempt food, but we like what Indiana did. Indiana did something in the early 1960s. They put a credit on that targeted tax relief to certain people. And Kansas came along with a credit called the Food Sales Tax Rebate Program in 1978. And what the idea behind that was to sort of buy off the revolution, if you will. We may not be able to afford to wipe out 15% of the sales tax base, but
that's how much of overall sales tax revenue we estimate is for food.
Yes,
right?
about 15% of the overall sales tax base goes to groceries. And by the way, when we say food, we mean groceries.
Yeah.
If
not restaurants.
Even states that have the food exemption, if you eat at McDonald's, it's going to be taxable, right? But we're talking about you go to the grocery store to buy a head of lettuce. That's what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And Kansas put on this food sales tax credit, and it was you had to meet both an income and demographic test. Someone in the household had to be above age 55 or blind or otherwise disabled or a dependent child below age 18. And if at least one person in the household met one of those demographic tests and the total household income was below a certain level, we're going to give you back as state income tax reduction or even refundable, send you a check to acknowledge that over the previous calendar year you paid sales taxes on your food, and we don't think you should have, right?
Yeah.
So it was targeted at the elderly, the disabled, people with kids. Yeah. If your income was below a certain level, you get this back. And we went along, and there were still efforts saying, this isn't enough. Everybody would benefit if we didn't have to pay sales tax on food like these other states. So the issue kept going in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. But the legislature responded, and it enhanced the credit several times. I think in 2002, maybe, or the sales tax was raised after the 9/11 recession, right? This is the one where the bad guys flew our airplanes into our buildings, not the Great Recession that came along a few years later. But there was tough times in the public sector, and the legislature had to respond with a tax package. And so when the sales tax rate would go up, like it did in 1986 and in 2002, policymakers would acknowledge this is going to be even harder on people paying sales tax on their groceries. So let's sweeten the credit to those who need it the most. And so that's the way we went down the aisle until 2012. And what happened in 2012 is we had the great tax experiment. The former governor said, well, look, the Great Recession seems to be taking longer to recover than previous recessions, and I think it's going to be this economic development competition between and among the states. We need to do something sexy here and get noticed in terms of our tax policy. And the people, which is the governor saying this, other people who said, look, we need to try something different. And so they wanted to have a radical reduction in income taxes. And but they acknowledged that was going to cost a great many hundreds of millions of dollars, and it did. So they put what he called pay-fors in his bill, in his original proposal. There was a relaxation of some severance tax exemptions that was in there, for example. There were other changes throughout the tax code, but one of the things to pay for the income tax cuts was a drastic reduction in the food sales tax rebate program. It was made non-refundable. Okay?
So if you didn't know any state tax, you couldn't
didn't benefit. Yeah.
It could only come off of a tax liability.
Exactly. Real quickly, let me give you tax credit 101. If I have $100 of income tax liability and I'm entitled to a $300 credit, if that credit is quote unquote refundable, which the food sales tax credit used to be, my $100 of liability is wiped out, and the state then sends me a check for the other $200. But if that credit is made non-refundable, and I have $100 of liability and I'm entitled to a $300 credit, my $100 of liability is wiped out and I just walk away.
Yeah.
I get no additional benefit. So taking away the refundability of the food sales tax program, which again we'd had since the 70s. It kind of, as I said, helped to buy off the revolution and make us not look so bad in terms of taxing groceries. That when that occurred, it really brought the issue more into focus. It certainly helped pay for some of the income tax cuts, but it made the issue that much harder. And now flash forward to the last couple of years, coming out of the pandemic, we're in a situation where three things have happened. The U.S. Supreme Court has enabled states to get more money on purchases made from out-of-state retailers, right?
Because a lot of people are moving to online sales.
Exactly.
Right.
And so this was a big issue for the states, and states are now able to collect when people order things from online vendors. But also the federal government came in and gave the states a lot of money, right? One of the perceived problems with the Great Recession was the ARRA legislation from 2009 wasn't big enough, right? One reason recovery from the Great Recession is thought to have taken so long is the federal relief package wasn't big enough, right? We're going old school Keynesian here, macroeconomic impact. So when the federal government, a couple of the bills were passed under Trump and a couple under Biden, but they had 3 or 4 pieces of legislation that pumped all this money, out there as people were locked down in their homes and ordering toilet paper online and all the other fun things everyone did there for a couple of years. They were cognizant that states were going to have problems with their budgets and all of this. So the federal government came along and gave the states a good bit of money. And the other thing that happened in Kansas that helped us get to this strong fiscal point we're at right now, and I will tell you, there's more money in the state general fund coffers now in Kansas than there ever has been, really in history, even in percentage terms. And part of that is because of a state law change that happened in 2017. What had happened is we had very severe budget problems in the state from 2012 through 2017 because of the tax experiment. It didn't turn out like some of its proponents had originally hoped. And Kansas had to return to a 3-bracket system and repeal the non-wage exemption for non-wage business income and these other kinds of things. And the legislature passed a bill, as I explained earlier, in 2017 that the former governor vetoed. And then Republicans and Democrats alike were frustrated after 5 years of this tough time that they overrode his veto in 2017. 84 and 27 votes were needed, and those votes were rounded up. And the law was changed back to move back to a 3-bracket system, which is what we had till 2012. We had a 3-bracket system from the 1992 through 2012. And because we went back to a 3-bracket system and we took away this exemption for non-wage business income, which, by the way, was one of the more controversial parts of the 2012 bill. It was one of these things where it wasn't just limited liability corporations and subchapter S's and sole proprietorships who got the exemption. It was royalty income, farm income, consulting income, any other kind of income other than wage income on God's green earth that you or your accountant could construe as non-wage business income, paid 0 income taxes on that. Okay. So this is one reason the state got broke. It just exempted way too much of this stuff. And that exemption was restored, and that kind of income had to start paying state taxes again in 2017.
So between that repeal and restoring that, getting taxes from non-wage income or business income, right, and between that and the infusion of federal
money,
dollars,
yes, the revenue elasticity of the income tax and the old state tax system, and then this new use tax money that's coming in from online purchases for 2 or 3 or 4 reasons, we are at a historic point here. We have a chance to do something I never thought there would be a chance to do, having talked with policymakers for some 4 decades about sales tax on food. Everyone always assumed the most we could ever do was to add a layer or two to the credit before we wiped out most of the credit in 2012. But the governor acknowledged and realized last fall, I think it was late October, early November, she said, look, there's even more money coming here with the new revenue estimates that are about to be released in November. We can really afford to do this. Kansas have been talking about this since 1937. let's take the sales tax off of food. We can afford to do the whole thing right away. Take all 6.5% state sales tax off of food on July 1st. And then she said in her State of the State speech, yes, do this. It's built into my budget. Hey, let's get this on my desk by Kansas Day, which of course is January 29th. And there seemed to be bipartisan agreement in both parties about that. Her presumptive gubernatorial opponent has made approving noises about wanting to get the sales tax off of food. And Republicans and Democrats alike, I think, in the legislature have said, sure, sure, sure. And everyone seemed to think it was going to happen. But you and I are sitting here in the middle of April.
With no bill.
With no bill, yeah. Yes. And that's one of the interesting things that you would know more about, certainly, than I would, the blocking and tackling of what goes on behind closed doors in the legislature. But it is, I will say, it's a bit mystifying. Kansas has, other than Mississippi, who is not always good company to be in, Kansas is the second highest rate on food in the country. There's only a few other states that tax food. Most states have a full or partial exemption for food. And the governor proposed to let's do this. We can. It will save the average. To the second part of your question, it will save the average Kansas family $500 or more a year. That money, I think, would further help. Going into people's pockets. It's going to further help stimulate the Kansas economy and be spent locally and this kind of thing. So sometimes these tax breaks that are offered for businesses and this kind of thing, you never really sure who the beneficiaries are. But the sales tax on food purchased in the state is something that's going to help for any number of reasons, not the least of which is the allegation for years is there's a third or more of the Kansas population who lives within an hour of a state line. And there's people that drive to Missouri or Oklahoma or some of these other states to buy their groceries and these kinds of things. Well, there's going to be less incentive for them to do that and spend their money here. And oh, by the way, if they're over in Missouri buying groceries, they might buy gasoline and liquor over there as well. Yeah. So Kansas is going to be bringing a lot of money home if we can keep people home here to certainly buy their groceries. That's part of it. Another part of it, of course, is that we're looking at pretty historic inflation here the last month or two because of the war in Ukraine and all the rest of this. Inflation is now as high as it's been since the early 1980s. Yeah. And people are noticing when they go to the grocery store how much more that hurts. Mm-hmm. This is even more badly needed now than I think some might argue than when the governor proposed it last fall. And getting it into effect by July 1, I think, I'm guessing for a lot, you and your legislative friends would remain a high legislative priority here as we head down the stretch into what's called the veto session here that starts in a week or so.
Well, one of the things about this that has been a little interesting, I guess, is that you talk to people individually in this building, everyone agrees that this needs to happen. I mean, on an individual basis, everybody wants it to happen. There's nobody that says, I don't think we should cut the food sales tax. There's discussion about how to do it, how long it should take, why we shouldn't be measured in it. People are worried about what does it mean in the budget 3 years from now, because it is expensive. It's estimated to cost about $450 million in the first year.
Yes.
And that's expensive. And that's always been the reason before that we hesitated, I think. That's a big cut to the budget. But as you pointed out, we're sitting on upwards of $3 billion over budget in revenue. And as you said, it's historic. And it seems that if you have that, to me, you have this historic moment, this historic revenue collection, it's probably a good time to look at getting rid of a tax that, in my view, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, I tell people at home, there's nothing that's a more broad-based tax relief than sales tax on food. No. If you're looking for broad tax relief that can affect and touch most families, every family in the state, it's going to be sales tax because all of us do that. All of us buy it. And you had made the point about the inflationary pressures, which I think is right. I think we saw about 8% inflation on food. We immediately knocked that down to take 6.5% of that out by removing the sales tax. still inflation, but we can kind of mitigate that by offering that savings. What other ways? So I'm curious, from an economist point of view, you talk about money will stay in the state because people have less incentive to shop out of the state. How do we think families spend that money when they're not spending it on tax on essential items like groceries? How does that money then recirculate into the economy when it's not collected as tax revenue?
Well, again, that's the interesting economic question. But if people have an extra $500 a year in their pocket that they would have otherwise spent on sales tax on groceries, they might use that money to put into their kids' college accounts. They might use that money to pay down back credit card debt. They're going to use the money, and in most cases, it's certainly going to stay in the state. These are Kansans who live here, eat here, work here, people who buy food in Kansas grocery stores. The assumption as an economist is the lion's share of that money is going to stay in the state, and then through the multiplier effect, if it's spent on other taxable goods and services, right, it's going to continue to stimulate the economy. That's the distinction between sales tax on food. I think it's an important one, and some of the other tax cuts that have been out there before that are not as broad-based and certainly not as well targeted. I remember during the previous administration, when we were talking about the great tax experiment, there was a former legislator from Johnson County who was a lobbyist. And I won't name who he was, but he was telling me, and he was a Republican, and he was a legislator for a number of years. He told me at the time we passed that, everybody was talking about this non-wage exemption I mentioned earlier. He said, "Hey, Chris, it's great that y'all are talking about this exemption for non-wage business income." He said, "I'm a silent partner in an LLC that owns a strip mall over here in Johnson County." And he said, "I think it's great that, but he said, I'll tell you, it's just not very well targeted." Because as a legislator, he used to talk with me about targeting and some of the issues you and I are talking about. And he said, if you guys wipe out state income taxes on that particular revenue stream for me, I'm not going to create any new jobs or hire anybody. He said, I'm more likely to put my wife on an airplane and go to Las Vegas with that. There's no mandate that I spend that money here in the state. And I thought, well, that's an interesting point, right? So it was a different thing than sales tax on food, certainly, right? All Kansans would benefit, I think, from having this extra $500 in their pocket. And the sooner it takes effect, the better, because of not just the inflationary pressures we talked about, but again, it's this notion we can afford it. And one of the ideas that was floating around before the legislature broke was to phase in the full 6.5% cut on food over 2.5, 3 years. I think to not start it until January 1st for some reason, and then also to phase it in under some formula for 2 or 3 years. And I guess that also was a little bit puzzling to me because as we just said, there's historically high ending balances, depending on your assumptions about expenditures, some $2.5 to $3 billion or more. And there might even be more money than that in the pipeline here next week if the consensus group raises estimates. And it is anticipated they will, for a reason I'll explain here in a minute. But some of the same people who are saying, oh, no, we really need to be careful that even though we got $3 billion in the bank, this $450 million could, imperil the state's coffers. Some of those same people were the ones cheering on a decade ago the great tax experiment, which in fact left the state in the red ink for many, many years in a row, when the state was having to do fund sweeps and find money in couch cushions and not make payments to the state pension program and get the state's bond rating reduced by Moody's and Standard & Poor's and everything else that happened a decade ago. Some of the same folks who were saying, oh, don't worry, this is not a big deal, are now all of a sudden worried that the state projected ending balance in fiscal 25 or 6 might be a problem. It's a little surprising to me. But back to the consensus thing, one reason I think it's anticipated money is going to be added here when the full consensus group reconvenes next Wednesday is because as if there were not enough imprecision in the revenue estimating process, trying to guess how much sales and income taxes come in. When we're done with it, we would always take and disaggregate it into 12 separate monthly sub-estimates for purposes of the monthly tracking reports, right? So you think over the course of a year, so much sales or income tax money is going to come in, and then you split it, how much is going to come into each month based on a different set of assumptions that we make. Well, the consensus group in November, again, revised the fiscal 22 estimates several months in. In the 5 months since the estimates were redone in November, we're more than $300 million ahead of the November estimates.
So
right?
all indications are
fiscal 22 estimates are going up, and then coming off a higher base, fiscal 23 will go up too. So if the CRE group, in fact, when they reconvene next Wednesday, raises both fiscal 22 and fiscal 23 net bottom line estimates, some taxes will go up and some will go down. But the big ones, sales tax, use tax, individual income tax, and corporation income taxes are all up and trending up. That will have a snowball effect. And if you're worried about the fiscal 23 ending balance, in all likelihood, it's going to have a lot more money there than that which the governor based her budget on. Because again, she was required by law to base her budget on the November estimates. There's now going to be even more money on the table. So this $450 million, I know there's people that think, and I'm guessing you might be one of them who thinks this, that if there's money on the table for tax cuts, that should be the very first $450 million out the door. Is to do, as the governor asked, the full and immediate, don't phase it in over 2 or 3 years. There's no need to wait till January 1st. Get the full tax cut implemented on July 1st. And I know there's a legislation in committee that would do that, but that's been not allowed to get out of committee. And there was a tax conference committee that wrote this plan that was going to phase it in over 2 or 3 years, but they didn't even allow a vote on that bill before they left town in April. So long story short, I'm not entirely sure what is going on, but again, it's the political vagaries of what might be behind that, or something you'd be more expert at than I am. I'm just an old country economist.
I had a friend tell me not long after I got here that the issue is never the issue. And I always have to remember that. Sometimes you think that if you hear that the reason we can't do it is because there's not enough money or we're worried about out years, there's probably another issue driving that. Because I've found that advice or that insight to be very true and very reliable. Before I let you go here, I would do this thing at the end that I always like to do if I can do it and remember it. I like to ask a couple of questions just to open it up for you. And if there's one or two things that you wish people knew or understood about economics, tax policy, life working inside as a bureaucrat inside the legislature, what would you wish they knew?
I guess how challenging it is for all 165 members of the legislature, right? It's one thing I developed a great deal of appreciation working for. We were a non-partisan staff agency. We worked for both political parties. And I got to know so many people over the years who were elected to the legislature. And in the computer era, there's texts and emails and so many other ways to get a hold of your, but the idea of the Saturday morning eggs and issues coffees back in your district and getting citizen input, right? And some of it can be angry citizen input, right? Going door to door and how hard it is to get here and then try and figure out what the majority of your constituents really, in fact, want you to do. Mm-hmm. Because the biggest challenge that's occurred to me is in politics, as in life, I think it's the squeaky wheels that get the grease, mm-hmm. right? And when you're in the Kansas legislature, you have a whole phalanx of lobbyists wanting to tell you that you need to do this or don't do that to my industry. And oh, by the way, we've got members back in your district, Jason, mm-hmm. They'll take you to lunch to tell you about it, right? That's a part of the process. Or you'll have someone show up and berate you on a Saturday morning when you're back at your local coffee house about property taxes, right? And because someone shows up and berates you, does that mean property taxes are totally out of control, or one person thinks they are? Mm-hmm. So again, you got to sort through all this noise because the great many of your constituents are going to their kids' soccer games and all the rest of this. They don't have time to stay engaged as the lobbyists or some of the people who might be able to show up at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning and berate you about property taxes. So you're trying to do the right thing for your whole district, and it's just, I wish people appreciated what a tough job you guys have when you're here, and the amount of pressure you're under. And unfortunately in Kansas, as I said, it's a part-time citizen legislature. You guys are certainly not paid enough. It's in California and some of these states, it's a full-time job, and they pay their legislators enough so they can eat,
and focus on the job.
In Kansas, so many legislators have to have other jobs and gigs, and it's tough. So that's an issue that I wish people knew, is how hard you guys have to work for how little you're compensated.
Well, I appreciate that. I want to give a plug to your old department and the revisor's office. I was asked, I can't remember where I was at, but it was a group of people, and I was speaking to a group of students at Hutch High, and they asked how do we write bills, and I said, if legislators wrote bills, it'd be a nightmare. I said, we have a whole team of revisors that they're very good legal minds and they understand the law, and we have an idea, and these poor people have to take our sometimes very bad and not well thought out ideas and turn those into pieces of legislation that conform with existing statute and conform with the Constitution. And they do that job very, very well. And I try to think about that as much as I can. I sometimes make the joke that if it wasn't for a research department and a revisor's office, legislators would be dawdling around up here not having any idea what they should be doing, because we might have ideas and thoughts and we might have contact with constituents, but we could never turn those things into actionable items if it wasn't for professional staff like your former department and the revisor's office to make those things into something we can use. Well, Chris, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and visit with me today. I'm a little bit of a nerd and I enjoy some of this economics discussion. I realize that not everybody does, but I do think it's important to understand how we frame the conversation around tax policy and how we gather the information that kind of guides our budgeting. And hopefully people listening have a little more knowledge about how this is done. It's not like you said we're just throwing darts at a dartboard. We're actually putting some thought into trying to come up with the best estimates we can and make sure that we're not too far off the mark, and then adjust when we need to. I appreciate your work in all those years, and I've appreciated your insight this year. It's been very valuable to me to help me understand issues that are a little bit above my expertise and a little bit above my pay grade. So thanks for coming on today, and thanks for all the work you do.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to thank a few of the people who've helped make that podcast in Hutch possible. My son Mitchell Probst wrote and recorded the music for the show. Jenny Brigette put together some great graphics and promotional art. And Chris Acker helps overcome my mistakes to produce a great sounding product every episode. That podcast in Hutch is made possible through a collaboration between the Hutchison Arts and Culture Collective and Salt City Sound. They're working to bring resources and infrastructure to support art, music, and storytelling in our community. If you have an idea for your own podcast, reach out to them at podcasts@saltcitysound.net. If you enjoy that podcast in Hutch, be sure to subscribe and share it with all your friends. You can also help support this production by subscribing to thatguyinhutch.substack.com or by emailing me at thatguyinhutch@gmail.com to learn about sponsorship opportunities. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join us again next week.
A Salt City Sound production.